Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Prime and Load. This is Lee Gugino, and I'm joined by our experts, as always, Drs. Andrew Bamford and Alex Burns. And today we have an awesome guest, Mr. Ewan Carmichael. And Ewan, I think I'll just pass it right over to you if you'd like to give us a little bit of background about yourself before we hop into our topic for today.
Certainly. Lee, ladies and gentlemen, hello, my name is Ewan Carmichael. As you can tell by my speech impediment, I'm from lowland Scotland. I'm a Brit, and I've retired from the British Regular Army. I started at the age of 17 as a reservist in our Officers Training Corps program, and I joined the Regular Army in 1982. Of all things, as a dental surgeon. I wasn't terribly good at that, so they kind of allowed me to command various medical units, and I finished up as Director General of the Army Medical Services just at the end of combat operations in Afghanistan. Highlights of career would be Medical Squadron Command in the First Gulf War, which was an excellent experience. Serving around the world in various trouble spots, setting up and leading the United Kingdom's Air Assault Medical Regiment, something called 16 Close Support Medical Regiment, with some excellent deployments in that experience. Then commanding 2nd Medical Brigade, which was all of the field hospitals in our army, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as I say, finishing as Director General. I'm talking to you today because of my special interest in the Battle of Minden, which was something that started as a 7-year-old when I got a prize at school with this fantastic picture of British redcoats discharging their muskets. And I just fell in love with that battle at that age. So when later in my army career I was posted to Germany and to Minden, it allowed me to walk the battlefield. I've written a book in the company of Dr. Andrew Bamford, who is my excellent editor, and it's a place I go to fairly often, and I would recommend it to listeners as a site. If you're in Europe, it's not a great site like Waterloo, but as a battle, it's really worth going to walk the turf.
I should just add to that introduction as well. Although Ewan reached such exalted heights in the real army, I first encountered him as a private sentinel of the 36th of Foot in the army of George II. So he's toted his musket with the rest of us as well. Mm.
Oh yeah, and that's a joy. And I confess to being an avid collector of military artifacts, both real and reproduction. In the 7 Years' War or French Indian War period, it tends mainly to be reproduction, although I do have gorget and a few musket balls and so on. But my bigger collection is of real Napoleonic artifacts, which I enjoy, and correspondence, actually. Sometimes the paper artifacts are really good fun. So I apologise for that diversion, but I'll just take the liberty, if I may, Lee, of just congratulating you all on what you're doing here, because the warfare of the 18th century is a bit of a niche topic, and we need to be a band of brothers and sisters supporting each other. And the fact that you're building this ecosystem of people with a love for the period is brilliant, and I'm a huge fan of your podcasts thus far.
Thank you very much. We really enjoy putting it together. It's a lot of fun, and yeah, it seems like this segment of history is certainly not at the, maybe I'd say it's probably more at the forefront here in the States with the 250th coming up. But as we've explored, that is still just a tiny fraction of this period. So, but getting into that, so like I said, the 250th here in America is well known, but the Battle of Minden, I think, Alex, maybe you'd agree or disagree, I think that's probably a little less well known. So could you give us, before we get into the nitty gritty of it, kind of the background of the conflict that this battle inhabits and kind of maybe a political setup to the events that we'll be talking about?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to do that, because context's really important in terms of this battle. As most of your viewers will know, it took place in the 7 Years' War, French-Indian War, which took place about 270 years ago. And as I see it, there were really two conflicts which intermeshed. You had the great powers in Europe involved in the 7 Years' War, which lasted formally from 1756 to 1763. But the conflict had already started in the North Americas, where Britain and France were vying for colonial supremacy. And the seeds of war are often born out of the results of previous conflict. And certainly in Europe, you had Frederick the Great and Maria Theresa of Austria vying with each other as a result of the War of Austrian Succession. Meanwhile, overseas, you had Britain and France competing for North America, but also for India. In 1756, France got the upper hand in North America, and that continued in the following years until 1759, the year of Minden, when the British won decisively at Quebec. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, the British were making better headway in India, conquering Bengal. Now, back in Europe, Frederick the Great made a preemptive strike against Maria Theresa by invading Saxony in 1756. And after early success, he was forced on the defensive by his defeat at Kolin. And he then had to oppose Austria in Silesia, France in Saxony, and Russians off to his east. Now, he successfully regained the initiative through significant victories at Rossbach and at Leuthen. And then he conducted a largely successful, if exhausting, war on all these fronts until 1761. And he was effectively saved by the death of Tsarina Elizabeth of Russia, and then the ascension to the throne of the Prussophile Peter III, and that tipped the scales back in his favour. The war formally ended in 1763 with the treaties of Paris and Hubertusburg. Prussia had survived the war, and the European map reverted largely to the status quo. Overseas, however, the situation was very different, and Britain had significantly overtaken France, her most serious rival in colonial domination. Turning to British involvement in Northwest Europe, an enduring aim of British foreign policy was the preservation of the liberties of Europe, which was throwing our weight onto the scales in order to balance in favour of the weaker side.
So, Ewan, can you kind of describe to us the situation that leads up to this battle, the situation in Europe?
Yeah, of course. The French advanced into Germany in 1757, and that was enough provocation for the Elector of Hanover, Britain's King George II, to declare war. And his Prime Minister, Pitt, agreed to fund the defence of Hanover. And that was always a problem for Britain, that King George was the Elector of Hanover under the old Holy Roman Empire system, as well as being King of Britain. Now, Hanover was effectively Frederick the Great's western flank, if you think about it in that way. And if that was secure, to a certain extent, his back was partially covered, allowing him to focus to the south and east. Now, Britain's first foray into Europe wasn't a huge success. Pitt agreed to an army of observation, which was mainly Hanoverian, and William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, the king's son, was an obvious candidate to command it. But at a key battle at Hastenbeck, near Hamelin, Cumberland, despite inflicting greater casualties on his French opponents, abandoned the field, and he withdrew to the north, giving up the defence of Hanover. And Westphalia, in northwest Germany, was overrun by the French in 1757. Under a treaty, the Treaty of Closter 7, Cumberland's losing army was disbanded, and Cumberland was obliged to return home to Britain to face his father's anger. And everything seemed bleak for the Allies at that point, with the Austrians even occupying Berlin briefly, until Frederick the Great created a resounding victory over the Franco-Austrians at Rossbach. And that encouraged George II, acting as King of Britain this time, then overturned his son's surrender and he resumed hostilities. At this point, it would be really useful to introduce a German, Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick. Now, he was Frederick the Great's brother-in-law, and he was the ideal candidate to be the fresh Allied commander. In November 1757, he quickly re-energized the army, and he mounted an aggressive winter campaign. The French army, overwintering in northwest Germany, away from home, wasn't in a fit state to resist. So that French occupation of Westphalia deflated, and the French withdrew back across the River Rhine. And the Allies acted quickly to fill that void being left by the French. And the 1st British Infantry Battalion was dispatched to the continent, and it landed at the port of Emden in North Germany. However, Ferdinand, in pursuing the French, overreached himself, and he had to withdraw back again across the Rhine. On the French side, meanwhile, they had 2 armies in the field against the Allies, and those were the Army of the Rhine up to the north under Marshal Contades, and to the south, the Army of the Main under General Soubise. He was later to be changed. So Ferdinand was opposed by 2 French armies working in concert against him, and he was numerically inferior. Additionally, the French were joined by 9,000 Saxons under their Prince Sava, and they had escaped the clutches of Frederick the Great. Back on his home bank of the River Rhine, Ferdinand was able to marry up with recently arrived an enlarged British contingent of 5 further regiments of foot, bringing it up to 6 regiments of infantry, 6 regiments of cavalry and supporting artillery. And that brought the Allied army up to a theoretical strength of about just over 66,000 in August 1758. Now, if you want to visualize what just over 66,000 looks like, I apologize to my American friends and Canadian friends. That would be the capacity of Scotland's national rugby stadium, Murrayfield. So you can look it up on YouTube. Now, anecdotally, the 2 Protestant armies, allies of Britain and Hanover, got on really well together, and there are accounts of the troops sitting around campfires, drinking long into the night, swapping stories, though scarcely able to understand each other. Sort of linguistic differences should never be an impediment to soldiers enjoying themselves. The British commander of that was the 3rd Duke of Marlborough, and unfortunately for him, he died of dysentery, leaving his subordinate, Sackville, and I'll go through who the different commanders were, known to the Americans as Germain, to command the British contingent under Ferdinand. And Sackville was an odd character. I think he had an infantry mentality rather than a cavalry mentality, and I think he was a very pedantic man, and he tended to irritate his superiors, and in fact he'd got to northwest Germany because he and the Duke of Marlborough had decided they would go coasting along the north coast of France, doing some amphibious raiding, which Dr. Andrew Bamford is an expert on. And in modern armies, you can imagine these chaps. They would go on deployment just long enough to get the campaign medal, and then move on to the next one. So there's a thing about human nature here. Sackville and Marlborough ending up in northwest Germany, Marlborough dying of disease, and then Sackville taking over.
So, from what it sounds like, I want to make sure that I'm understanding our timelines. So, very broadly, the beginning of operations in Europe do not go well for the Allies. As time goes on, things start to get a bit better, but now we've got an army that's got kind of two leaders in it who don't work well together.
I would say when you say for the Allies, I would call it the Western Allies.
Okay.
So this is combat in West Germany, as opposed to what Frederick the Great was doing, looking sort of south and east. But you've got multinational operations with the potential for misunderstanding. Nowadays, of course, logistic planning and scientific advances has the potential. Those have the potential to make it more difficult to operate together because of technical issues, and yet because of treaties and agreements and collaborative work, we try nowadays to make sure that things are of similar patterns so that allies can interoperate. And then you've got linguistic challenges. You've got a British army speaking English. You've got German allies speaking mainly German. You've got officers who might be able to speak in French to each other, but with all the potential for misunderstandings. And you've got potential for petty jealousy as well. And we know that there were frictions between the Brits and the Germans, despite being on the same side. So, for example, before he died, the Duke of Marlborough was very envious of the fact that an elderly Hanoverian general was superior to him. You've got this English belief in the power of the power of being English. So anyway, I'm kind of digressing a wee bit.
No worries.
We're coming up to a bit where, if you're happy, I'll just discuss how we get to the doorstep of Minden, and then that would be a great point to discuss the ground.
No, that's perfect.
In March 1759, Soubise, the commander of the southern French army, was replaced by Broy. Broy, spelt Broglie, I suppose you could say. And the two armies united at one of Ferdinand's main blocking points, the city of Kassel. And the French maintained pressure on Ferdinand, and they identified that the small fortress town of Minden, slightly to the north, which had plentiful stocks of ammunition and rations and had a bakery, if they could seize that, they could interpose themselves between Ferdinand and Hanover, the city he was meant to be protecting. And they could do that at a key crossing point over a river. So Broy sent his younger brother ahead with a light force. Now, you would expect the French to approach a town in Germany from the west, but instead, Broy, the younger Broy, rode to the south and crossed a river and effectively came in from behind the fortress of Minden. He only had a light cavalry force and some light guns, so he doubted he could storm a fortified town. But some enterprising French hussars patrolling along the river that protected the town, and I'll talk about that when we come to the ground, they learned of a punt which was hidden in some reeds on the far side of the river. And on the 9th of July, just under a week before the battle, some bold Frenchmen swam across the river, collected the punt, brought it back, and then they were able to ferry 40 men at a time across the river, creating a small lodgement under the walls of the fortification. And eventually the French had some 300 men across, nestling underneath the fortifications. A few light guns enfiladed a hornwork protecting the bridge over the River Weser, and Broy's light troops frontally attacked the hornwork, driving the defenders back and leaving either gates or a part of a drawbridge open, which allowed the three men to rise up and effectively gain entry through the rear of Fortress Minden. And they captured some 1,200 prisoners. So the fort that we're going to talk about and its supplies and this major river crossing were now in French hands, and their way to Hanover was open.
That's awesome, Ewan. Can you give us an orientation of the battlefield that we're going to be talking about? Kind of what the important key pieces of terrain are, and kind of where forces are, so we can help build our mental map of this area.
Thanks, Lee. Yes, of course. If your listeners could picture a sheet of paper laid out in landscape fashion, and if they were to imagine that the top of the page was north, and if they were to draw a line, vertical line down the center of the page representing a river, that's the River Weser, quite a significant river that flows northwards up into the North Sea. And then if they could draw another line from left to right across the center of the page, making a cross in the center, that would be a fold in the ground, a ridge, the Wiehengebirge Ridge or the Wesergebirge Ridge off to the east. And that's a fold which is something like 250 yards high. So quite a steep ridge and quite a significant obstacle. And the ridge has a gap in it through which the River Weser flows up to the north. So you've got this mental map with a cross at the center. And you've got 4 quadrants. You've got up to the northwest, down to the southwest, and northeast, southeast. Now, if you can imagine just above the ridge in the top left quadrant, a stream running from west to east and joining the River Weser, running parallel to the ridge, and that is a stream called the Bastau stream. It's quite a small stream, it's about 3 yards across, but it's got very boggy banks and a bit marshy and a bit treacherous. So that's your top left-hand quadrant. Just to the north of that stream, but hard up against the River Weser, so fairly central, is a fortified town, the town of Minden, which has a kind of Vauban-esque defences. It's been quite bombed during the Second World War, and the defensive walls, the glassy walls, have been taken away, and that's now parkland. But if you look at it on a map, you will see that zigzag outline. And then if you look northwest from the town of Minden, there is heathland, what's called Minden Heath. And sprinkled over that are some small farming villages, which play their part in the battle. Moving now to the bottom left-hand quadrant, the southwest quadrant of the mental map that we've got, near the River Weser is a town called Gofeld, which features in our story because there was a parallel battle on the same day, which was part of Ferdinand's design for battle. And that lay astride the French line of communication. So the French line of communication came up from the south, through Gofeld, crossed a small river there, and then went up through that gap in the ridge, the Minden Gap, Porta Westfalica, as it's called. So that was their principal line of communications. If you think about the River Weser, it's quite a significant river, quite fast flowing. It's at Minden, it's probably about 70 yards across, and it has a main road bridge which leaves the town and heads off towards Hanover. So that would be the route to Hanover that King George II would be really concerned about. There's also a small ford, but it doesn't really play a part in our story. But the French who captured Minden also put in 2 pontoon bridges just to the south of the main bridge, and those bridges play a part. In terms of going to an 18th century army, the River Weser was a major significant obstacle. The Bastau stream was also an obstacle. You certainly would have difficulty getting guns across it. It was largely unbridged, and it would need bridging if you were going to do something about it. Now, I mentioned that the French had captured Minden earlier on in July. The Battle of Minden took place on the 1st of August, so we're interested in the events between capture and the battle itself. The French were in Minden itself, garrisoning that, and they were nestled between the Bastau stream and the Wiehengebirge ridge, with the River Weser at their backs. They could cross the River Weser and they could move on to Hanover to attack it, but at the moment they were sitting pretty. And Ferdinand's allied army, a mixture of Hanoverians, British, some Prussians, and some other little German states. Bear in mind that North Germany is a patchwork of small states. Politically, Minden belongs to Prussia at this point. It was given to Prussia as a result of the Peace of Westphalia of 1648. So Frederick the Great also has an interest in Minden at this time. Now, the Battle of Minden took place in high summer, and as far as I know, there were no real peculiarities about the weather. It was probably generally pretty fine, typical European summer. On the eve of battle, which was just before the 1st of August, we do know that a particularly ferocious windy storm blew up. I don't think it was raining heavily. No, people don't tend to mention the rain, but it was certainly profoundly windy and noisy, and apparently the wind masked the sound of church bells, which may have been a factor in terms of security and secrecy as the battle preparations were finally unrolling. I need to also mention the going on that Minden Heath. It was heathland, small farms, a lot of hay, meadows, grass, that sort of thing. Not particularly heathery, so I think good going. You might call it reasonable tank country.
Awesome. And you've talked a little bit about some of the commanders and some of the forces, but can we go through who's commanding the French forces and what are the forces he has at his disposal, and same thing with the Western Allies?
Sure. The French army overall was commanded by the Marquis de Contades, Louis-Georges Erasme Marquis de Contades. He was 54 years old, and he'd been a soldier from the age of 16. He had been the colonel of the Flanders Regiment at the age of 30 and was a lieutenant general by 1740 and made a marshal in 1758, so the year before Minden. He'd been present at Hastenbeck in 1757. After the Battle of Minden, he ceded command of the Army of the Rhine to d'Estrées. He was the commander of the Army of the Rhine, but he was the overall commander appointed by the king with a subordinate army. That was the Army of the Maine, originally commanded by Soubise, but then command was transferred to Victor Francois, the Duke of Broye. He was 14 years younger than Contades and a cavalryman. He'd been the colonel of the Luxembourg infantry. He was an experienced soldier. He'd served under de Saxe, the wonderful de Saxe. He too was present at Hastenbeck and at Rossbach. Despite the outcome of Minden, which we'll be talking about, King Louis used him to replace Contades. Now, later on, Napoleon blamed Broye for the French defeat at Minden, so that was a curious decision. Later in his career, he won at Korbach. He was defeated at Bellinghausen, and he exiled himself from France during the French Revolution. Turning to the Allies now, I've said it was a patchwork of Allied nations under the command of Ferdinand, the Prince of Brunswick, Lüneburg, Wolfenbüttel. He was born in 1721, and he was brother-in-law to Frederick the Great. And he'd served as an ADC to Frederick at Mollwitz, and much of his formative service was in the Prussian army. He was appointed to command the Allied army in November 1757 after Cumberland's disgrace at the Treaty of Klostertzeven. He was appointed Field Marshal in 1758. After the Battle of Minden, he was awarded the Order of the Garter by George II of Britain. He had continued success in the west after Minden, effectively protecting Frederick the Great's back. Now, there is another Ferdinand in this complicated network of command, and that is also another chap from Prince of Brunswick, the hereditary prince, another Ferdinand. And he was Ferdinand's nephew, who was born in 1735, and he plays a part in the small parallel battle at Gohfeld. And then the third character that I need to mention is Lord George Sackville, who was the British contingent commander under Ferdinand. And he was born in 1716. He was the third son of the Duke of Dorset. He had been a cavalryman from the age of 21, but he commanded a foot regiment, later the 28th Foot, in the War of the Austrian Succession. Now, there is a great book out by a chap called Piers Maxey, which is called The Coward of Minden, all about Sackville. And interestingly enough, at the Battle of Fontenoy, he led his regiment fairly boldly and was actually captured by the French, and his conduct was admired by them. So he was introduced to Louis the 15th, which I think is a mark of honour, really. He joined the 3rd Duke of Marlborough for amphibious raiding off the coast of France, and he was the second in command to Marlborough in the British contingent, and then rose to command the contingent when Marlborough died. After Minden, he was disgraced, as you will hear, but he reinvented himself and was styled Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for the American Department. But his lack of clarity of orders to how further tarnished his already damaged reputation. So you'll hear more about him as we go on.
Ewan, do you mind if I interject with a question for a moment?
Please do.
On the sort of question of this patchwork force, especially for American listeners, if they think about the 7 Years' War in Europe, which I'll warrant they don't very much, it may be usual for them to picture the British army squared off against the French army, and you've already told us that's not exactly what's going on here. But if we were to think about the 4 largest contingents of this Western army, it would be the Hanoverians, the British, the Hessians from Hessen-Kassel, and then the Braunschweigers from Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Would you say these forces are of a comparable quality across the board? Your mentor at Sandhurst, Christopher Duffy, once described the Hanoverians saying they were in every way the core of the force. Do you agree with that? Do you think it's an army that's built around the British army or the Hanoverian army? How would you characterize this patchwork army?
I think there was a fair amount of uniformity between them. I this is just my instinct. It's not a scientific answer. It's a gut feeling. I think there were remarkable similarities. I think a lot of the North German states mirrored each other. Frederick the Great was... there's military fashion, isn't there? And you tend to mimic whoever has won the last war. And I think there was a lot of mirroring of Frederiциan style, drill, and so on. I think they were probably relatively comparable with minor differences. I think you've probably got the Brits imagining they're better than they are, if I'm allowed to say that. You've probably got a fair amount of German arrogance. I think when the British contingent turned up from the North Sea after a long march through Germany, they were fairly bedraggled, and there was an account of a fairly pompous German officer, a liaison officer, who was sent to meet them, and I think he looked with some disdain at their what you might call sort of practical marching turnout. But Ferdinand noted that the weapons were clean. Maybe that's the key thing.
That's great. Thank you so much.
And you had mentioned that the Western Allies are numbering about 66,000. Is the French force fairly comparable to that, or?
At Minden, in terms of forces on the field, I'm working with a figure of about 85,000. And for American listeners, the Rose Bowl Stadium has a capacity of 89,000. And returning to good old British rugby, Twickenham has 82,000. The French had something like 48,000, and between them, Contad's Army of the Rhine had about 35,000, and Broye had about 13,000. On the Allied side, we had 37,420, and that was divided between Ferdinand himself, who had about 25,000, and he had a subordinate commander with a corps, von Wangenheim, German, with about 12,000. Now, typically, as the armies of the day, you had horse, foot, and artillery. The French had quite a significant amount of cavalry, 79 squadrons in total, 79 battalions, and 162 guns. The Allies had 62 squadrons of horse, a lot less foot, 43 battalions, and about 106 guns. So the French overall were outnumbering the Allies. Interesting enough, on the sporting analogy, the French number is the same as their rugby pitch, the Parc des Princes. So there you go. I have to have a. If there are any francophones listening in, I'll give you that one.
Very generous, especially on an episode of Minden. So we've talked about the forces and the commanders, but could we talk about what exactly the mission of each army is?
Absolutely. The French, of course, capitalized on the success of capturing Minden, and they converged on it. And they nestled in, as I said, in the town, and also behind the Bastow stream, with the ridge behind them, but also the River Weser off to the east. So they were in a pretty strong, impregnable position, and they were blocking Ferdinand from being able to protect Hanover. Ferdinand's position, he approached from the northwest, and as he did so, he dropped off that subordinate corps I mentioned, Wangenheim, with a subordinate corps of about 12,000 men. He dropped them off at a town to the north of Minden, near the Weser, a small settlement called Totenhausen. And then over the next couple of weeks, Ferdinand deployed his army in an arc in that northwest sector, the northwest quadrant of our mental map. And he appeared to string his army out. He drove in French pickets and then advanced in a big arc. So if you can imagine that entire northwest segment, he encamped out on the heath and put pickets out in the small villages to his front. But there was a bit of an air gap between von Wangenheim's corps, which looked quite isolated up at Totenhausen. And the whole aim of Ferdinand was to entice the French out from that very secure defensive position. He recognized that the defensive situation that the French were in would be a tough nut to crack because of the obstacles, the Bastow stream in particular. And if it was going to be difficult for him to break into that, if he can entice the French out and catch them astride the obstacle, he would get them at a disadvantage. And his orders to his subordinate commanders focused on them converging together, concentrating their force. They were a bit strung out, but as and when the French attempted to break out of their strong positions, if he could get his subordinate commanders, to march forward, that perimeter would shrink and collapse down and effectively concentrate his force. So he instructed his army to be available in 8 columns, which would march from their encampments towards that centre of that mental map that I've sketched out, and thus concentrate on Minden Heath. part of his plan was that he mentally envisaged that there was a small village called Hallen, and that would be his right anchor for his force. And I think mentally he envisaged that that would be where he would have his right flank. Wangenheim would advance into prepared positions up to the north of Minden, but Wangenheim was the bait in the trap. That was the isolated corps that he wanted to tempt the French out with. At the same time, he wanted to pose a threat to the French and to their lines of communication. So he ordered his nephew, the hereditary Prince of Brunswick, the other Ferdinand, to march with about 10,000 men out in a big loop across the Wiehengebirge Ridge and down into that southwest quadrant of our mental map towards the town of Gofeld, which was astride the French line of communications. So Ferdinand aimed to present both threats and temptation to the French. On the French side, Contad's aim was to use Broy's corps as the main effort. Now, when the French converged on Minden, Broy's corps, the group that had originally captured Minden, was left on the east side of the Weser. So they were encamped to the east, but they were able to cross the river Weser because the French had put in a couple of pontoon bridges to the south of Minden, and there was the main Hanover road as well. So although separated by the river Weser, that large obstacle, it was crossable, and within a couple of hours a corps could be across. So Contad's plan was Broy's corps would be the French main effort, and he would use that to cross the river Weser, pass through the fortress of Minden, and then advance north and to take out Wangenheim's corps up at the settlement of Totenhausen. At the same time, improvised bridges having been constructed, some 18 in total, they would be thrown across the Bastau stream, that little stream just to the north of the Wiehengebirge Ridge. And Contad's main army would cross those improvised small bridges by dead of night and would advance up onto Minden Heath to fix the main Allied army. Now, much is made of the French dispositions and that they had their cavalry in the centre, which was thought to be highly unconventional at the time. The reality is that both armies had horse in the centre. You've got to bear in mind that the French main effort was Broy's corps advancing up along the river Weser, just to the west of it, and attacking. So the French cavalry, although looking to be in the centre, was actually on the flank of the main effort. I mentioned the hereditary prince being sent down to threaten the French line of communications, and the French responded to that. Contad sent another commander, de Brissac, down with about 8,000 men to protect their lines of communication at Gofeld. So both sides had detached forces down to that sort of southwest quadrant on the other side of the ridge. Ferdinand, who comes out of the Battle of Minden as the victor, is applauded for his generalship. But if there was one failing, I would say that he had ordered his columns to advance forward to shrink the net round about the French breakout. But his orders to the commanders didn't include what he expected to happen when they reached the field. And to a certain extent, that contributed to the action on the day. So we get to the point where we're on the eve of the 1st of August. The two forces have been sent down to the southwest quadrant for the battle that will take place in parallel at Gofeld. Both armies are ready to go, and a spy suddenly enters the story. A chap called Lohrmann, the spy of Minden, who was a citizen of Minden, who for some reason, which nobody understands, was sent by the French with a message outlining their plans. But he diverted and was brought to Ferdinand, and Ferdinand was alerted to the French plan. So he was able to give a warning order to his army to be ready that night for the concentrating action. And then, unfortunately, the great windy storm blew up. So at the dead of night, this huge gale blew up, masking the sound of the French preparations. The French preparations being to bring Broy's corps across the River Weser, in through the town of Minden, and then up to strike north, and also for the remainder, the Contad's main body, to lay their improvised little bridges over the Bastau stream and to debus out onto Minden Heath. From the listener's point of view, I find it quite useful to divide this quite complex battle into several phases. And there's preparatory stuff with Broy's corps crossing the River Weser and these improvised bridges going on. But the first big one is what I call shaping operations on the Allied right. And the second one is Broy's attack on Wangenheim's isolated corps at Totenhausen. And the third is the actions around von Sporken's infantry division. The fourth is the German completion of the destruction of the French centre. And last but not least, the fifth is events associated with Sackville's cavalry on the Allied right. So the first of my main phases of the Battle of Minden is the shaping operations on the Allied right. The hereditary prince advanced towards Gofeld on the other side of the ridge, just to the south, some 15, 18 kilometres to the south of Minden, but in three prongs. He had infantry heavy in the centre, and he himself took some cavalry down towards the south, and a gun heavy detachment went up to the north, so a sort of trident pointed towards Gofeld, and it was part of Ferdinand's design for battle. The French responded to the centre prong of the trident, advancing away from a bridge which they were protecting, and they encountered the Germans on something which is now known as the Bloody Meadow. As a Mexican standoff took place on the Bloody Meadow, but the hereditary prince had brought his rapidly moving cavalry force round to the south, enveloping the French left flank, which drove the French to try and escape up to the north, where they then ran into the left prong of the trident, gun-heavy sort of cut-off group, and effectively that French force dissolved. I don't know exactly how many casualties there were, but subsequently some 1,900 skeletons were found on the Bloody Meadow, and we certainly know that there were 300 prisoners of war and 5 French cannon captured at Gofeld. Some fugitives probably ran up through the Minden Gap up towards Minden, alerting Contad to their loss of that force that was meant to be protecting their lines of communication.
So this other engagement, this is a deliberate battle to help shape the actions that'll come later?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are further shaping operations as well as precursors to the main battle.
And what was the intent behind this kind of satellite engagement? What was the at least hoped for effect on the battles, the fighting at Minden?
Ferdinand intended that he would simultaneously pose a threat to the French rear, but also bait his trap with the isolated corps of Wangenheim up at Totenhausen, which might tempt the French out. So the whole point was to tempt the French into action to get them out of their very strong defensive positions.
Because, I mean, to some extent, Ferdinand has a very difficult task, right? I mean, he's trying to pry an enemy that outnumbers him, that's on a fortress, out of prepared positions, basically.
Absolutely.
So it's a, yeah, I mean, it's very audacious.
It's very audacious. And ultimately, successful, but it all hinged on early warning. And he had pigeted the little settlements out on Minden Heath. But the storm masked a lot of the French activity. So come the night, the warning that Lorman the spy gave to Ferdinand was slightly nullified. And that got worse, actually, because as the French were starting to break out after last light on the eve of Minden, Broy's corps crossed the pontoon bridges and also the main crossing, got up through the town of Minden and started moving northwards to advance towards von Wangenheim's isolated corps. At the same time, they also sent several battalions out to the west to pose a threat to Ferdinand's right flank to try and cross the Bastau stream way out to the west at a tiny little isolated crossing. Now, Ferdinand hadn't anticipated that, and he'd put certainly a battalion and a couple of guns there, so he had blocked that one off. But in his mind, I mentioned the fact this village of Hallen was going to be his right flank, so there was going to be some shaping going on there. Some French deserters were picked up and brought into the Allied headquarters during the dark of night. But the duty officer, the Prince of Anhalt, for some reason allowed a key moment to slip by for 2 hours. So in a plan where time is absolutely critical, where Ferdinand has given a warning order to his army to be booted and spurred and dressed and ready to go in your encampments, and the commanders have recce the routes that their columns will take to get onto the Minden Heath. They lose 2 hours of vital time. So eventually, after 2 hours, Ferdinand is informed that the French are breaking out, and he rides forward to try and establish the truth. And he goes to the village of Hallen, where he's expecting to anchor his right flank, and his columns will march forward to that and then be arrayed on the heath in concentrated form around about Minden. And he learns to his horror that the pickets, one village short of Hallen, have allowed the French to break out. And he learns that 2 regiments of the 2 battalions of the Brigade Champagne, which is a great name for a formation, the Champagne Brigade, have already started to infiltrate Hallen, the place he was going to anchor his right flank. And unfortunately, the officer in charge of the picket at that village, and the next village along called Hartum, is the same old Prince of Anhalt. So in an interview without coffee, Ferdinand, in the dark of night, orders Anhalt to take the picket forward and drive the French out, which eventually happens. And it's psychologically in battle, if you can put in a counter-attack, even a fairly light one, before the enemy have get established on their objective, particularly at night, you have a reasonable chance of driving them off, and that is exactly what happened. So his right flank was now secure, and that allowed one of his columns, which was effectively British light artillery, to dominate the area round about Hallen. And there are 2 artillery batteries who live on in the British Army in terms of the heritage, who behaved boldly by moving forward and trying to kind of suppress the French batteries as they were trying to come on to the Minden Heath.
So it sounds like the Allies are successful in getting the French out, but it's not getting a great start. There's a few hiccups.
It's not a great start. They get them out of the town that's going to be Ferdinand's right anchor. But if you're Ferdinand, just as dawn is breaking, he can probably see some smoke off to his left, where his isolated corps under Wangenheim is, at Totenhausen. If he looks over his right shoulder, there's something going on over the tiny little isolated crossing over the Bastow stream where he put in a battalion, a couple of guns to block it because there's something happening there. And there's been an engagement on the main battlefield just off to his right at Hallen. So in terms of information overload to Ferdinand, it's all happening. So we've had the shaping operations on the Allied right to kind of protect that right flank. But what's happening over on the left, and that's at Totenhausen, that was the French main effort, as you remember. So the second phase is Broy advancing from Minden up towards Totenhausen to attack Wangenheim. So he's got this corps advancing, and it's a strong corps, reinforced by a couple of brigades potentially on his left flank to provide support to him. And as he advances north, there's a ditch between Minden and Totenhausen, and that was going to be the start line for their attack on Wangenheim's isolated corps. And in the kind of half light, Broy's corps advances in three echelons, guns to the fore, and they encounter von Wangenheim's pickets, who withdraw just in the kind of very, very early light. And for some inexplicable reason, Broy's corps halts, and they decide just to bombard the positions where the pickets were, possibly waiting for the two brigades to come up on the left. So they start this desultory bombardment, but don't advance. So they've bounced the pickets who've withdrawn, who inform Wangenheim that there's something going on, and Wangenheim marches his corps forward into prepared positions. And Broy sees that, and rather than identifying that as a march forward to identify prepared positions, he thinks it's a full-blown counterattack. So he orders his force to halt and consolidate where they are, but not to press home the attack. And that's a major failing for the French.
Well, is there any indication of why they don't really press home the attack?
Yeah, well, as I said, it looks to sort of contemporary observers nowadays that the assumption from Broy was that Wangenheim's corps was advancing in strength and it was a full-blown counterattack. Rather than we know that they had some trenches dug or similar defences, and they were just going to occupy those. And Broy seems to have been faint-hearted. It may have been because it wasn't fully light yet. It may have been because he was still waiting for supports to come up on his left. But he certainly misread the situation. He was the main effort, and he was going to be the strike force that would drive Wangenheim back, which would then dominate Ferdinand's left flank, allowing his army to be rolled up. So it was a major failing, and we now know that Napoleon blamed Broy for the loss at Minden
because of this failed action.
Yeah,
and from what you said before, that seemed like kind of a harsh criticism.
No, I tend to agree. Actually, yeah, I think if you are the main effort, you've got plenty of resources, and you've got to understand your part in the battle. Nowadays, of course, with mission command and the style of orders that we give, you understand the higher concept, the higher picture. So your mission is to achieve whatever you're given to do in order to, and that in order to the sort of the purpose of orders is highly important, and it develops initiative, really.
It does seem, just jumping in here for a moment, with both armies, really, you've got commanders coming up with plans that almost the staff structure, the organisational structures aren't really up to supporting. I mean, is that fair? Are they trying to do too much with what they've got?
Well, certainly both plans are quite complex. There's a lot happening simultaneously, and particularly, I think, for the French. The French had their orders in writing. Ferdinand's were verbal orders. I quite admire Contad's orders, but as I say, there's a lot going on, and it's complex stuff. And if there's a fault with Ferdinand, it's he doesn't appear to have made clear the higher picture. You are to advance in column number 3 in order to. There doesn't seem to have been an order to part from contemporary viewing, but it's difficult to know with oral orders.
Hey everyone, Lee here for the Prime and Load team. We're passionate about exploring 18th century history and tactics and bringing those stories to you. But we need your help to grow our ranks. Please share this episode with a fellow history buff, leave a review where you can, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Most of all, join our email list. It gets you updates and insights into what's coming. You can join by using the link in this episode's description below. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the episode.
So if I could just kind of review to make sure I have things clear in my mind, Ewan. Moving, I guess, from the French perspective, kind of oriented north from the east to the west, there's been a short skirmish in advance of the village of Tottenhausen, sort of in between that and Minden, and both the forces under Wangenheim have moved into their prepared positions. The French attack, which is some of the best troops in the French army. They have like some of the grenadiers of France, I think, are bogged down or not going over onto the attack.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the two forces are also in contact at the village of Holland on the sort of right flank of Ferdinand's army and the sort of the left end of the line of battle on the French force. And that was the skirmish that was happening in the previous evening. Is that continuing at all? Are both sides kind of glowering each other but not directly in contact as there's fighting up on
in the village of Holland, the French have been driven off.
Okay.
And the Allies are effectively in Holland with light artillery in support. But at the same time, there was also the French feint way off to the west, which effectively was a distraction, a feint just to hopefully get Ferdinand to commit troops out on his extreme right.
If I could follow up on that for a second, it's fascinating to me, not just because my college roommate was named Eichhorst, which is I think the village where the French come up from in that sector. It looks like the French have their Ferdinand's really used an economy of force there. It looks like he has a battalion and maybe some fletches or prepared positions. Is there any part of him you think that says, man, the French have more forces there, maybe I should shift forces to cover the dam that kind of crosses the stream there? Or does he just kind of continue moving forward and see that feint for what it is?
I think he sees the feint for what it is, but he does send a couple of extra guns just to reinforce the defenders. But I think he recognizes it for all it is, and because the defenders are protecting a causeway across some pretty unpleasant boggy terrain, I think he's confident that they can block that. So he's not going to be distracted too much by that feint. And his main, his whole thing is his army concentrating by marching forward in that quadrant, the sort of shrinking sector, as they concentrate and march forward towards the center of that cross that I've asked your listeners to visualize on the map.
I think it's also very fascinating. Obviously, Napoleonic Wars, in the terms of the scale, what's going on is a step up in complexity. But what's going on here really does kind of put paid to the idea that 18th century warfare is very simple and everyone's lined up, all in one sector of the battlefield, and then the Napoleonic warfare is very complex with lots of moving parts. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts here.
An awful lot. I mean, the frontage is not massive. It's 5.5 miles, 9 kilometers. But in terms of command and control by horse, and so on. It's fairly manoeuvrist. It's bold stuff. It's exciting. It's admirable. And there are loads of human touches that just bring it to life when we get on to the actual combat on Minden Heath. Some of the correspondence afterwards really just makes it as exciting and interesting as anything in the Second World War.
So we're getting into kind of the
main meat of the battle.
The main effort.
And the main meat is effectively the third of the 5 main phases. What happens to Sporken's column, his division, which is 6 regiments of British foot and two battalions of Hanoverian Guards, and the story of what happens to them. Between 6:30 and 7 o'clock, one of the Allied columns under the aged Hanoverian General von Sporken had moved from its bivouacs and shaken out into line of battle. And his column consisted of 2 brigades, a forward one under General Waldegrave and a second echelon under General Kingsley. In each brigade, 3 regiments of British foot, and then off to the left, 2 regiments of Hanoverian Guards. And they'd shaken out into line and passed through a line of fir trees and out onto the heath. And because they were first onto the heath, there was a danger that they could become quite exposed. And Ferdinand saw that, and he sent a famous message which was received by the second echelon, Kingsley's brigade, that when the time came, they were to advance with drums beating and to attack whatever they might encounter. Now, for some reason, which we'll never know, Sporken's column seemed to take that as an order to advance, and it comes back to this thing of miscommunication between multinational allies. Anyway, as the British and the Hanoverians emerged from the strip wood, there was a large body of enemy horse that they could see about 1,000 yards away to their front. And that was the first line of Fitzjames's French horse. Now, from the French perspective, Sporken's redcoats must have looked very exposed, especially as there was no formed body appearing between them and the village of Hallen. And the recommencement of the advance must have surprised Ferdinand, who attempted again to halt it, but to no avail. Anyway, the lines came under fire from about 60 French artillery pieces just to the south of the village of Hallen. And the 2 flank battalions, the British 12th of Foot and the 20th of Foot, suffered the most. Now, in today's British Army, their achievements are celebrated by the Royal Anglian Regiment, that's 12th of Foot, and the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, that's the 20th of Foot. One Lieutenant Thompson of the 20th of Foot wrote from hospital afterwards, "I saw heads, legs and arms taken off every minute." It was at this point that Contades sent word to Broy to halt his advance as the main effort, while Fitzjames dealt with this bizarre manoeuvre occurring on Minden Heath. So the order was given to 12 squadrons under the Marquis de Castries to attack, so that's over 1,000 horsemen. And the charge would build up from a walk through a trot, only attempting to gallop at the very last moment. In terms of cavalry charges, control over the body is the most important thing. It would be vital at this point for the Allied infantry to hold its nerve. The order would be given to halt. The first rank would kneel. The other 2 would close in and sort of lock on. And the order would be given to fire at relatively short range, crashing out and bringing down horses and riders. And the effect of that must have been really, truly awful, with dead and dying and tumbling horses and riders. So the charge was ruined, but still with the capacity to kill, if you can imagine the momentum of tumbling horseflesh, perhaps in the Kentucky Derby. The order would be given to the infantry to reload, and the sergeants would be pushing men forward to plug any holes in the ranks. There was a second French charge. Fitzjames ordered his second echelon, second line to attack, and that was 22 squadrons a bigger force under Dumisnil. And despite the obstacles of shattered horseflesh to their front, they nevertheless managed to raise a charge. Again, a volley would crash out. We might talk about volley fire versus platoon or divisional firing later, bringing down both men and horses. But before the French could organise another charge, the drums beat out and the Allied lines stepped off again. Now, this advance rendered Spoorken's column even more vulnerable, this time to infantry on the French left under de Guerchy. And de Guerchy ordered 8 battalions forward to engage. And that was a vulnerable moment, but the lead Allied brigade commander, Waldegrave, saw the risk, and he ordered the 12th and the 37th of Foot to effectively refuse a flank, presenting a greater number of musket barrels towards the enemy and infantry. Interesting, the 37th of Foot is, in today's British Army, the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment. A musketry battle ensued between the two sides' foot, and despite the relative inaccuracy of individual weapon, against a mass target, the fire would be murderous. And gradually, the superiority of British musketry told, and the Guerchy's foot melted away, leaving dead and dying on the field. And a bit like curtains opening on a stage, that revealed a greater threat, some regiment of grenadiers. And as a Lieutenant Montgomery calls them, as fine and terrible looking fellows as I ever saw. He also describes them having rifles with superior range, which the British had to advance through in order to be able to engage. Now, the Brits drove them off, but they reformed again just out of normal musket range, so the 12th and 37th had to advance again to repeat the performance and advance through their fire and drive them off. The second line of Spoorken's formation, Kingsley's brigade, had come forward, so by now Spoorken's division was effectively one long line. Now, as an indication of the intensity of this phase, Kingsley's horse, the 2nd Brigade commander, was fatally wounded in 4 places, and it collapsed, trapping him, and he was advanced over twice by Saxon infantry. And the roll call of the 12th of Foot shows that battalion could later muster only 4 officers and 13 files of unwounded men. So that's 13 files of somewhere between 120 and 200 files at the start of the battle. Now, at this point, the French launched their cavalry reserve, the 3rd echelon, and that was 18 squadrons of the elite Gendarmes de France and Carabiniers under Despoins. And at this point, Ferdinand saw the ultimate vulnerability of his line, and he ordered forward further Hanoverian formations to Spoorken's left, with 30 heavy guns also to support, as Ferdinand described it, the 6 English regiments who behaved like a brazen wall. Now, this 3rd French cavalry charge, 2,000 horses, couldn't achieve a frontal charge, so they tried to work round on Spoorken's left. And just as they were about to crash into the rather threadbare line, the Hanoverian artillery opened up on them. And the line had wavered, probably, but it had held just. And the moral effect of having repelled these French cavalry charges was now leaving the French vulnerable to rout. The next element of the battle is what I call the German completion of the destruction of the French centre. Contad's centre still had 8 battalions of infantry of de Beaupreau's corps to the south of one of the small villages, and Contad sent a rapid order for them to attack the Allied foot. And that took place exactly as Imhoff's Hessian column was also coming forward on the Allied side. And the momentum was now very much in the Allies' favour. And 4 battalions of Imhoff's Hessians came forward at the double and put in a spirited charge before Beaupreau's brigades could deploy fully, forcing them back, we are told, at bayonet point. And also at this point, the Duke of Holstein's 8th column of Ferdinand's aid, of 19 squadrons arrived also from their lodgment, swirling around and driving the French foot back onto the remnants of their own cavalry. Now, a further French 8 battalions remained uncommitted under Saint-Germain, but they were to face a fresh threat as that isolated corps under von Wangenheim started to advance. And just as Saint-Germain's 2 brigades began to move forward, they were met in turn by the battalions on Wangenheim's right. So the French centre was now dissolving, and panic was communicating itself through the French remnants, as it would do. And the army began to lose confidence and stream rearwards. Broy directed his corps, which had taken casualties, but relatively speaking was relatively undamaged, to act as a rear guard, which it did, retiring slowly back under the safety of Minden's garrison guns by about 10 o'clock. So the last phase that I'd like to examine is now the events associated with Sackville's cavalry on the Allied right. There had been several opportunities for Lord Sackville's 24 squadrons of Allied cavalry to intervene. They were on the extreme right of the Allied army, and Ferdinand's aim had been for Sackville's column to move in concert with the rest of the army. Now, it was a mixed bag of British horse, but also German horse in 2 main echelons, 2 main lines, but the different nationalities were mixed in by regiment together, so it was quite a complex mixture. Several attack options existed for them, but as yet there was still no sign of Sackville's troopers. They'd received an order to move out at 4:45 a.m, and by 5:30 they were formed up and mounted, but waiting for their commander, Lord George, to turn up. And his second in command, the Marquis of Granby, had supervised the turning out and the preparation, and then went off to Sackville's headquarters to try and find him. On arrival, Sackville ordered the force to move off at a walk, and they were met by a guide. Despite the relatively tardy start, they reached the forming up point before Sporkin's column passed through the strip wood. Sackville deployed the column into 2 lines. One of Ferdinand's aides-de-camp arrived with orders to move through some trees to the left and form behind Kingsley's brigade to support the advance. But Sackville appears to have assumed that it was just a preparatory order. And then another messenger arrived who emphasised that the order was to be obeyed immediately and by all of the cavalry. At this point, Sackville ordered the horse to draw swords, and he led them off to the right instead of the left. And as he was doing this, yet another messenger, a Lieutenant Colonel Fitzroy, arrived and attempted to instill yet more urgency. But he said it was to be only the British horse in a mixed force of British and Hanoverians. Sackville insisted that all 3 repeat and clarify their orders, and Fitzroy, who outranked the other messengers, insisted that the French were in disarray and that the English cavalry could earn distinction. The key was that the infantry needed support, and they needed it urgently. Even 14 squadrons would have had an effect. Ferdinand was deeply anxious, and he sent 2 gallopers to hasten Sackville, stating, "When is the cavalry coming? Good God, is there no way of getting the cavalry to advance?" Instead, Sackville rode personally forward through the belt of trees to seek clarification from Ferdinand himself. Fitzroy led him off at a gallop, but Sackville approached at a more controlled pace. And for Ferdinand, that was the last straw, and he directed Fitzroy to seek out the cavalry's second in command, Lord Granby, and bring on the second echelon, saying, "At least he'll obey me." Granby rapidly grasped the situation and quickly set the second line in motion, but he had to move around the stationary first line. Sackville trotted up to Ferdinand and asked what his orders meant, and Ferdinand's response was controlled and restrained. "My lord, the opportunity is now past." Turning back, Sackville saw Granby's line coming forward, but ordered him to halt, to restore the original order of march. So after a long, unnecessary delay, the 24 squadrons were formed into one long line at the start point of Sporken's advance. But by now the infantry had long gone and their backs could be seen in the distance. So rather than turning victory into a rout, Sackville's cavalry had been kept pristine, to the immense frustration of his subordinate commanders.
So there could have been a much more crushing defeat
Absolutely.
for the French if that cavalry element had actually pursued them like he was ordered.
Absolutely.
Wow.
It would have been truly one of the great battles, and they missed the opportunity.
Is there any indication like where the confusion came from? I mean, he gets a few sets of orders that kind of say fairly similar things, but
that's a really good question. I personally think that Sackville was no coward, but I think he was very pedantic and prickly and very conscious of his own dignity. And we have accounts that he and Ferdinand had not hit it off well. So in the period leading up to the battle, they had fallen out over various options facing them. So there was a lack of confidence in Sackville, and Sackville was pretty full of himself. I don't think he had what we would call coup d'oeil, the ability to sort of sum up a situation in an instant with a glance of an eye and know what to do. I would hope that most people would understand the necessity of marching to the sound of the guns and doing the right thing. I think just his pedantic, stubborn, prickly nature meant that he was very conscious of the orders he was being given by whom and how to do things. So I think that was basically it, and much of that comes out. I'll talk about his court martial shortly.
Maybe Drew, right before the court martial, what was the strategic aftermath of this battle? So the French are able to sort of, to a point, get away, and what's the ramifications of that?
By 10 o'clock, the battle was effectively over, and Contade ordered a general withdrawal, but those orders were unnecessary because his army was already going without orders. And by about 11 o'clock in the morning, the French were already back across the Bastow, and one Allied artilleryman, seeing them running off up towards the ridge like a flock of sheep, expressed amazement at not seeing the cavalry pursue them. Contade ordered a council of war, but rather than withdrawing down to the south along their proper lines of communication through the Minden Gap, because of Goffeld, that was seen as an impossibility. So Contade opted to escape to the opposite bank, to the east bank of the River Weser, and then head south that way. And as they did that, they left their casualties behind in Minden, but they destroyed the two pontoon bridges behind them. The French were forced to move southwards down towards Kassel and then west towards Frankfurt. And they fell into a sort of passive lull for the rest of the year. And they were never to be successful in venturing back towards Hanover for the remainder of the war. So in terms of Ferdinand's objective of protecting Hanover, with a byproduct of protecting Frederick the Great's back, that was highly successful. For the Allies, the immediate aftermath of the battle saw them dealing with the dead and surviving casualties. They advanced to just short of gunshot outside the walls of Minden, and an officer and a trumpeter were sent to demand the fortress's surrender, which was declined until the following day, when the garrison left along with the bulk of the French army. As many as 1,000 live casualties were on the hands of Allied regimental surgeons, who would have had their hands full. And I mentioned Broy's attack with a start line at a ditch called Walfahrtsteich, halfway up between Minden and Totenhausen. And I think Alex had mentioned the Grenadiers de France and the Royal Grenadiers, the Grenadiers Royaux, having been repelled by Wangenheim's corps. and that ditch was reputed to be thick with the dead and wounded. So the dead were collected and buried in mass graves, and as many as 2,000 local peasants were pressed into the task of supporting that. And for the Allies, the orders were issued for a service of thanksgiving and a feu de joie, that rippling sort of celebratory fire down the ranks. Now, in terms of the casualties, French losses are hard to quantify totally because there would be many deserters, but the best figures seem to suggest just over 7,000 killed and wounded on the field, and possibly 1,533 found when the Allies entered Minden. Some people were apparently drowned fleeing through the Bastow stream, and the 25th of Britain suggests that some 4,000 died in the Bastow, but that seems impossibly high to me. What is certain, though, is that the French lost 6 generals and 438 other officers killed and wounded, and the French cavalry had lost some 28% of its strength. And to give you a thumbnail sketch of the infantry, the regiment of Touraine lost some 909 killed, wounded and prisoners of an effective strength of 1,230, so 909 out of just over 1,200. The Saxons that I mentioned also suffered heavily, and their commander, the Count of Lusace, was wounded, and they lost some 33% of their strength. For the Allies, there were about 2,800 casualties, and the British furnished half that figure with 1,400. And again, to give you some thumbnail sketches, the 20th of Foot experienced the highest casualty numbers with 317, 51% of their strength. They were in Kingsley's brigade and closest to Hullen, where there was quite heavy artillery fire. In the order of the day following the battle, the 20th of Foot was actually taken out of the line because of its severe losses. And in the reports of the day, that it should cease to do duty, a measure to which the regiment refused to submit, resuming at its own request its place in the line. It's worthwhile touching on the events after the battle regarding Sackville. There had been puzzlement in the Allied ranks about the non-appearance of Sackville's cavalry, and Ferdinand had kept the worst of his anger against Sackville under control during the battle. But when he occupied Minden, he issued a special order of the day in which he publicly thanked most but not all of his subordinates. He praised Granby, the second in command of the Allied horse on the right, stating that if he'd had him at the head of the cavalry on the right wing, the decision of the day would have been more complete and brilliant. Now, Sackville was mortified by that omission, and he canvassed Ferdinand to alter his order, but to no avail, and Ferdinand actually formally asked George II for Sackville's removal. News of the victory reached London a week later on the 8th of August, and every street was reported to have 2 bonfires, and the king issued an order for Sackville's recall. Sackville applied for a court-martial before he could be dismissed from the army, and a warrant was issued for his arrest early in the next year, that Sackville had disobeyed Ferdinand on the field of battle, which would be a capital offence. The trial lasted for some 6 weeks, and conflicting views of Sackville's conduct emerged. He did have some very loyal subordinates who spoke in his defence, but politically this was always going to be awkward for the king, as there was implied criticism of Ferdinand's style of command, and Sackville's acquittal would embarrass the king. So Sackville was pronounced guilty, and whilst not executed, was adjudged unfit to serve His Majesty in any capacity whatsoever. His name was erased from the Privy Council, and his disgrace was published in the order book of every regiment in the British Army. So there you have it. It's a great victory by an Allied army, with a notable part played by the infantry and the artillery, and it's still celebrated today by the regiments and batteries involved in Minden Day.
Okay, so as a child in America, the first time I was aware of the Battle of Minden was when I saw a news story that a anonymous benefactor would send roses to the UK consulate in Chicago on August the 1st in honor of Minden Day. And that's something that still goes on. The at this point it's been going on so long, they think maybe it's a provision of someone's will, that, you know, there are still roses sent to the Chicago consulate every day. Can you tell us a little bit why someone in America is sending roses to the British consulate in Chicago on August 1st? Why are roses associated with the Battle of Minden?
Yeah, that's a really important question. In sort of British folk memory, the concept of the Minden rose was significant. It's now far less significant, which is a great shame, because the Battle of Minden's been overshadowed by Waterloo, and then, of course, by the huge remembrance events associated with the First World War, and then with enormous living memory, the Second World War, that it was one of our great battles. And there's this belief that the soldiers in the army bedecked themselves with wild roses plucked from the field of battle. And there are sort of two accounts. It was either on the advance to battle, they gaily did this. I don't believe that for 1 second. A forced march towards a field of battle in the dark, you're not going to be plucking roses. But I think in the days after the battle, while they were celebrating, having their Thanksgiving, there probably were lots of wild roses around, and they probably celebrated, just cheerfully doing that sort of thing. It may have been they were mimicking some of the German regiments which would use green field signs. So there might have been they were having a laugh at their allies' expense. For whatever reason, in the regiments that have descended from the Minden regiments, they still use roses on Minden Day. So on the 1st of August, the regiment is paraded, and roses are carried onto the parade ground, and every soldier gets one or two roses of various colours depending on the regiment. So the anonymous donor towards I think it was Kansas first of all, and then Chicago, starting for many decades, has been sending these roses. Probably an expat Brit, I suspect, but maybe not. Maybe just a friendly face, and then the executors of his or her will. But it's a good story. But the Minden Rose lives on. There is a folk dancing group somewhere in southern England, Morris dancing, which is called the sort of Rose of Minden. I think there's a Minden Rose. No, it's Battle of Minden pub somewhere again in Hampshire. It's just one of these sort of charming sort of regimental traditions, but celebrated also by the Germans. They built a monument near Fangenheim's Corps' engagement at Totenhausen, which surprises the Brits because being Brits, we think that we're the centre of the action. And where von Sporken's column was, maybe that's where the monument was. But von Wangenheim and his corps, they're celebrated by the monument built by the Germans. And Brits were invited over, I think it was the centenary, British representatives of the regiments involved were invited. And roses were sent to their hotel rooms on the morning so that they could wear them at the commemoration. And then it happened again 50 years later. And really poignantly, only 5 years before the start of the First World War, but the Minden regiments were well hosted by their German sort of colleagues, and again roses delivered to their accommodation rooms. So friendly relationships between Brits and Germans at Minden, and it's celebrated every year now.
I should say, as well as an offshoot, of course, it's Yorkshire Day as well now, which I think I'm right in saying stems from the 51st, who became the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. So at least some of the roses must have been white.
Yeah, absolutely. And King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, they're now part of the Rifles as the contemporary cap badge of the British Army.
So from an outsider looking in, it does seem like Minden has a hold on British history and iconography. Is there a specific reason for that? I mean, we talked about there's kind of a shortfall in some parts of the battle. So why is this such an iconic battle for the British?
It used to be considered one of Britain's great infantry battles. And I think to people in the know, it still is. And that stems from the concept of Spocken's column advancing initially unsupported, seemingly isolated, and also relatively unconventionally in the day to advance unsupported against horse. Traditionally you would expect the infantry to obligingly wait while the horse pranced about and showed off. So there's a social class thing going on here, so it was a kind of unconventional thing to do, to advance and destroy the horse in the way that they did. So gallant Thomas Atkins, I'm sort of predating the Duke of Wellington calling him Thomas Atkins, but gallant Tommies advancing, supported by their obliging Hanoverian friends. And sadly, not enough is made of the Royal Artillery. We talk about the British infantry, but I think credit is due to the Royal Artillery, which ably supported the infantry. And of course, the poor old cavalry regiments, which were present at Minden, but not really involved. They don't celebrate Minden Day at all. Their event is the next year at Warburg, where the second in command of the cavalry at Minden, the Marquis of Granby, led the Allied cavalry ably with that coup d'oeil, the ability to sum up the situation with a glance of an eye. And he charged, his wig came off as he charged the Bartley, and he went bald-headed at the French, and so on. So the cavalry's justifiably proud of Warburg. But there you have it. Yeah.
So Ewan, I'm going to derail the conversation here and ask you some questions because I'm fascinated by infantry firefights in the 18th century. I think, as you know,
yeah, absolutely.
And I'm delighted to hear you talk about rifles at Minden. Do you think so I guess I have a couple of questions. First of all, do we know which Saxon units have rifles? Is it the officers who are using their personal arms? Are there Jaeger kind of parceled out among the units with rifles? I mean, do we know the source of this rifle armed fire?
Yeah, it was one of the British officers. I think I said it was Lieutenant Montgomery who described it. We're pretty confident that the French weren't using rifles, nor were the British. So this may have been a fairly remarkable discovery. But we do know that the Saxons had been experimenting with rifles. And it could well have been that the 9,000 or so Saxons who'd made their way away from Frederick the Great and sort of joined on with the French army brought these experimental rifles with them. The level of detail in terms of their issue and their availability, I'm not entirely sure. We know what regiments were there, but I don't know if it was officers or sharpshooters, as it were, Jaeger, who possessed the rifles. But it was certainly enough for this officer to mention it, and for it to be an achievement that the British foot appeared to have had to advance through the superior range of the Saxon rifles. Well, as they were described as French rifles by the officer describing them, but to advance through, to drive them off, the enemy withdrew and then re-engaged again, and to have to go through the sequence again. So I think it's fairly significant. I think it's, personally, I like it. I like the story. It's credible, but I don't know the level of detail. But I'd love to talk more about musketry with you, because I think it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I will just say, I think it's fascinating, and it opens some sort of parallels in my mind. There's a really gripping account from a Prussian officer, Ernst von Barsewitsch, at the Battle of Liegnitz in the following year over on the Eastern Front, if you will, where Frederick is trying to sort of face off the Austrians and the Russians. And he describes having 2 Jaeger in his platoon, and he's just in a mainline infantry regiment. I mean, obviously the men are issued with smoothbore muskets, but he orders the Jaeger to sort of pick off an enemy officer, and for a while that quote has often perplexed me, because we're not really sure how the various Jaeger Corps in the Prussian army are used. I mean, maybe they're being parceled out to each platoon of infantry to have, a couple of sharpshooters in the unit. That's one possibility. It's also possible he's not referring to Jaeger in the actual Jaeger Corps of the king, but instead huntsmen who are in the unit, who are sort of good shots. They're firing with smoothbore weapons. But if there are Saxons who are firing with rifles here from sort of regular mainline Saxon infantry regiments, it's absolutely fascinating and something I definitely am gonna kind of look into a bit more. So thanks so much.
I think it would certainly be worthy of further study, but it may not bear fruit now. Certainly very much, but.
I did have an idea. I don't know if you recall, you and I think were chatting about it when we were working on your book, but some of the Saxon cavalry had been dismounted and converted into grenadiers, and had possibly been issued with rifled carbines when they were cavalry. And I was speculating whether they might have kept those in their infantry role. Which
I think Andrew, you're spot on, and that's beginning to tease my memory now. I know that there is a bit of a discussion about the effectiveness of 18th century musketry and the ranges at which musketry battles happened. I think there's a lot of armchair generalship about this, and there's a lot of patriotic enthusiasm of waiting till you see the whites of the enemy's eyes, and real pluck and sort of grit and so on, showing one's superiority. And our dear friends, the French, there is this view that the French provide a convenient target array, which is unfair, because, if you win a great battle, it's a great battle because the enemy is pretty good as well. And that's one of the things I like about Minden. It's, the enemy is exciting. They try bold things. The commando raid that captures Minden in the first place is great. So turning to musketry, of course, the kind of guys who enjoy shooting nowadays, very often there's a focus on individual marksmanship. And of course, we're looking at a squad weapon against a cluster target. And a musketry battle is a reciprocal relative activity. So it depends on what the enemy is doing when you're getting ready to fire. And I think there's a lot about whether or not you're in a defensive posture or you're advancing. And again, it's relative. Can you get a good shot off at moderately close range sooner than the enemy? And it's that kind of three-dimensional chess of making the decision. And of course, then you've got human factors. You've got anxiety, you've got soldiers quite happy to sort of pop off shots to convince themselves that they're doing something useful. I think for me, there's a really important bracket, and it's somewhere between 80 and 120 yards. And bear in mind that in the reloading sequence, that you can probably, at a kind of reasonable marching pace, cover about 30 to 40 yards while the enemy is reloading. So if I'm being engaged by the enemy at under 80 yards in a sort of solid group of troops in line, it's starting to get dangerous. And we know that the rounds kill people and cause serious wounds. At the other end of that bracket, at the 120 yards, manoeuvring about, it's certainly not safe, but in terms of gambling terms, the stakes are better. So I think all of these factors come into play. There's a bit about volley fire versus platoon firing, and much is made of Marlborough and platoon firing during Marlborough's wars at the start of the century. But I think if you're faced by a cavalry charge, the idea of a volley is more useful. But these guys didn't come to this totally afresh. They weren't just thrown onto the battlefield. They had time to think these things through. They had time to rehearse. And we know from Corporal Todd, who wasn't at Minden, that British regiments would practice different drills. And on the day, you would have sergeants and the officers you could play tunes with volley fire versus platoon firing, depending on what you were up against. These guys, they weren't they may have been stiffly dressed, and they may have worn silly hats and all the rest, but they thought about their jobs. And we know that with Corporal Todd, that small groups of soldiers would wander around the country practicing taking pot shots at posts or fences, much to the locals discuss. So I believe these guys were professional in their own way, and they had lots of different techniques, and given time they would know what to do. If you're in a defensive posture, somebody might pace out 50 yards, put down a stick in the ground, might pace out another 50 yards, put another stick down. So you could plan for the enemy advancing through distance. It's certainly what I would do. I suspect Lee would do it. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, even at Vellinghausen, Corporal Todd describes a couple of Highland sergeants going out before the main body of the unit, almost acting like skirmishers. I mean, there are examples of sort of similar things happening all the way back in the 1730s, where the French and the Austrians are squaring off and at Parma and Gustula. I guess that it's a here at Minden, and I don't want to trample on anyone's sort of favorite wait to see the whites of their eyes moment, but it's fascinating to think about the different ways that you could receive cavalry, and waiting until they're very close before opening fire is one thing you could do. It's interesting though, a cavalryman who achieves some fame, infamy in the American War, Bannister Tarleton, he's a real believer that the best way to stop an enemy cavalry advance is firing with platoons at about 200 yards. He thinks that will deter the enemy cavalry, will sort of break up the charge as they're coming in, which, I mean, obviously he's not well known as an infantry officer, but maybe has the experience of being on the receiving end of some of this kind of fire. It's a fascinating kind of debate, but you and I think you're exactly right. They're not just sort of like well-dressed marionettes who are there to do exactly what is written in the drill book. They kind of are working through these ideas in the field. They're sort of practicing around with this. They're much more serious, I think, soldiers sometimes than maybe you would look at if you just looked at a wargaming table or you just looked at a reenactment. I mean, it is absolutely life and death, and sort of working through some of these things in the field is definitely, I think you're right, going on.
Absolutely. And as I say, get away from the armchair theory and looking at these humans in the field, surviving, fighting, winning. They did it all.
Now, we've got I think a few more questions that maybe Lee has for you here to wrap up. But if I could just, and this is pure personal indulgence, so I apologize for that. But I knew Christopher Duffy when I was a little younger than I am now, and he was sort of in a later stage of his career, and we actually met at the meeting of the 7 Years War Association in South Bend, Indiana, for a number of years, which is like a wargaming society, basically. But of course, you knew him, I think, probably before I was born, and sort of had the advantage of maybe seeing him and others in their prime at Sandhurst. Can you tell maybe a little bit for our listeners, what was it like to be there at Sandhurst with figures like Chandler and Christopher Duffy? I mean, what was it like to learn military history among these sort of giants in the field?
It was fun. That would be the one word I would use. And you're talking about gentlemen who were very conscious of their standing in the pecking order of book sales. So professionally envious of somebody who'd produced, a bestseller, John Keegan, for example. He was outgunning many of them. So the pure academics like bless Christopher, fantastic, profound work, but not necessarily high street or railway station bestsellers. He was an absolute gentleman and a joy to be around. He would cycle around in his big baggy duffel coat, and he would have dinner in the mess. And he was ultimately approachable. He was a lovely, lovely man, and we were all very lucky to have had him and his interest in the subject that we really appreciate. But to give you an example, so we had a kind of military history group that still goes, but it used to be hugely popular because of the stature of these authors. At dinner afterwards, I once said to him, I'm not a big fan of Frederick the Great myself, and he bless him, he did agree. He was definitely an Austrian at heart. So yeah, no, it was a fun place, and these guys, they created one of the major reenactment organisations in Britain. Peter Young, who was a brigadier, who'd been a commander in the Second World War, set up the Sealed Knot to reenact the English Civil War. And officer cadets were pressed into providing bodies of pikemen and musketeers. And in those days, before reenactment costume was as professional as it can be now, people were turning out with old shotguns and gum boots, Wellington boots, and things like that. But these cadets used to kind of add tone to an otherwise vulgar brawl, and they would sort of turn up, and sort of female university students would be very, very impressed by the drill of Rodden's foot or whatever. It was a fun place to be.
That's awesome. And I'm sorry, I've got a question as well. Before we get to our last section here, as a modern military professional, we talked a little bit about it during a break, the idea that the 18th century still has lessons to be learned even in a modern military. What do you think is the Battle of Minden? What's the biggest lesson or one of the important lessons that modern military professionals, officers, senior enlisted, can glean from an engagement like this?
Oh, that's a really brilliant question, Lee. I think there are several aspects to it. Probably the key one would be to do with orders, appreciation, as we used to call it, summing up the situation, understanding it, understanding the nature of the problem, and it's now, the estimate, but orders, and making sure that your subordinates understand the nature of what they're being asked to do, and what the higher purpose is, so that if all's turning to ratchet, that Corporal Snodgrass can seize the moment and win the day for you. So I think that's probably the key thing. But there are parts about multinationality, about communication. There's a bit about rehearsal. So we know that Ferdinand ordered his subordinate commanders to recce the route their column would take, and to kind of cut debouchement in hedges and so on, so that their column could get onto the plain in the dark. There's a bit about just true grit, actually. Your day's turning to ratchet, but you've got to kind of stand there and take it, and you've got to fight, and you've got to keep fighting, and you're exhausted, and you're short of water, and it's frightening, but just keep going, because the same applies to the enemy. And if he or she gives up before you, then you hold the field, and you won. So there is that as well. And then I think there's another lesson, which is about military heritage for armies. I think celebrating victories, but truthfully, is really important. So I think a modern US Marine, if he or she understands about their heritage, they know that if it's their first ever operational deployment or engagement, they know that they're not alone, that their forebears have done this as well, that it went a bit wrong at times and they kept going. Friction, Clausewitz's idea of friction, war being frictional, fighting through the friction in order to triumph in the end. I think all of that is really, really important. And regimental heritage, giving you something to be proud about, is good. But I did temper that by saying truthful. It's very easy to have a chocolate box or, sort of playing card or book pictures with heroic acts and Highlanders storming things in kilts, and which I love, of course. But this idea that the enemy is somehow, as I said, a convenient target array for you. The enemy has initiative. The enemy is trying to do what you're trying to do to them, and they might be doing it faster and more efficiently with better resupply. So don't underestimate your enemy. Understand the truth about casualty rates. We sort of look at things and we think, we won and all is well. Actually, when you look at regiments that won, even going back to the ancient Romans, a hard-fighting legion, in combat would lose a lot of men. So going into that prepared is really important.
That's awesome. Yeah, I couldn't help but think while you were talking about this what a standard 5-paragraph order would have done, or heck, a radio would have done. Just those little things.
Absolutely.
And I appreciate what you say about the heritage. I think the Marine Corps is better about it, but the truthful part sometimes
I know
it's a little wishy-washy. But
yeah,
but
Lee, I have to share with you, I'm very proud to have been part of the 1st Marine Division in the First Gulf War, or in the period leading up to it. I was in 7th Armoured Brigade as a medical squadron commander, until, of course, the effort got bigger and we got dragged away to join in the 1st United Kingdom Armoured Division as part of 7th US Corps. But I'm very proud to have served alongside the United States Marine Corps, which is a very fine organisation. They were fantastic to us, to me, and it's something I reflect back on with huge pride.
Thank you. Yes, the Marine Corps is it's a wonderful and very interesting organization. I did have the opportunity to work with some British Army soldiers while I was in Belize and in 29 Palms and things like that. They are some of the most positive people in the face of, like you say, rat shit. They are unshakable. They're always a good time. Moving on to our Murmurs in the Camp section. So this is the last little bit. We've got a question. If you could witness any historical battle, which would it be? I think as much as we love Minden, I think we'd all want to see that one, but putting that one aside, which battle would we want to witness? And Ewan, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, well, there are so many out there. And I've been a bit selfish because I think I'd like to go all the way back to Thermopylae, just to witness that, because I think that must have been humbling, if it's 100% true. Of course, Waterloo as a Brit, but again, truthful history. I recognise the huge part that the Germans played at Waterloo, and I recognise that I don't believe that the Battle of Waterloo could have been won without the Germans. I don't think it could have been fought without Wellington and the Brits. So huge. So I think seeing that would be really important. Quite fancy some modern stuff. The Austro-Prussian War side of would be fascinating. But I'm going to plump for a fairly unusual one, which might surprise you, which would be the Great Siege of Malta, 1565. The Order of St. John and the Maltese peasants defending Malta against the great Ottoman army and seeing it off. I think that just as a kind of Renaissance period where there is so much change, I think it'd be really interesting to see that.
That would be cool. Andrew?
I think that part of me is tempted to say a very small one with very few casualties, because I mean this is not something I necessarily want to see, certainly on a full stomach. I suppose the historian's answer has to be something where there's a mystery to be unravelled. I'd have been tempted to say Minden before you barred it, just to see how and why that that command dynamic did and didn't work. But since you've barred that, I'm thinking very fast on my feet.
You got to keep it interesting.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Ewan, but as a Scot, maybe Culloden. Just see how close that came to breaking or not. The Highland charge at the last moment. How close
that's a really interesting one. And as a Scot, of course, the assumption by many of your listeners might be that my automatic assumption is that I'd have been on the Jacobite side, and I think it's really important for modern audiences to understand that Culloden was not Scotland versus England; it was British government troops versus Jacobites. And that was both political and religious, and I strongly suspect I'd have been on the British government side had I been alive at the time. So there's a lot of romance associated with the Jacobites, which is great fun, and I love that. But in real hard-nosed practical terms, I think I would have been on the government side as a government Scot.
You pick up on a point that we made in one of the previous episodes, talking about exactly that distinction. No, it's good to hear it backed up.
Alex, what about you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel a little bit, underwhelmed here at the end. You've taken 4, and then Andrew, you've given the answer that as a civilian, do I belong near any kind of battles? But I guess the historian in me, I'm gonna probably take Ewan's route and name a few here, unfortunately for listeners who are getting ready to end the episode. I have a love of the ancient world. I've always been fascinated by the Peloponnesian War, and so just looking at what the actual mechanics of hoplite battle were like, I think as someone who's read a lot of literature, thinking before I started really tangling with Koine and Attic Greek, maybe I'd want to be an ancient historian. That holds some attraction for me. I think as an American, I think I've got to say Gettysburg. It's a huge part of our national memory. We just had 4th of July here. We're recording this in July for it to come out on the anniversary of Minden, of course. And my wife and I were just out in Gettysburg, and as a rather portly American, I struggled to even cycle up to the top of Little Round Top, much less sort of fight up it without, like the Alabama troops did. So I mean, there's an enormous amount of respect, for the troops there. But really deep down, I'm an 18th century historian. I focus on the Prussian army. I would really like to be not necessarily at the battle, but just to be with Johann Dietrich von Holsten's corps through Saxony in 1760. It's a part of the 7 Years' War that's always fascinated me. I'd get to meet, in addition to Holsten himself, Steuben, a sort of future American officer as a young man. It's about a month-long period of the 7 Years' War that's always just held great fascination for me, and I think I'd probably have to pick that, as much as I'd love to see, one of the battles from the Peloponnesian War or Gettysburg, something like that. I mean, it's just you want to know what's actually going on as a historian. You're trying to get to that truth that you all have referenced, and it just would be a hard one to pass up.
What about yourself there, Lee?
I think right off the bat, I think I know for sure which one it is, and I'm sorry, it's not a hugely famous battle, but the Siege of Fort Niagara in 1759, and this may be no surprise to Alex.
Okay, yeah.
But especially the Battle of La Belle for me, which is kind of it's the maybe someday we'll get to do an episode on it, but it's kind of the climax of this siege where English musketry really shows its mettle again. There's a relieving French column that's coming down the Niagara River and meets up with a British line defending the siege works, and it absolutely pummels that relief force. And I think being able to witness that, there's some very good scholarship on the siege and on the battle itself, but there's still a lot of very unanswered questions. So this would be very much a fact-finding, notebook-filling, observation from the time-traveling weather balloon. So I think that's got to be my answer.
Able to meet the greatest line officer of the British Army of the 7 Years' War, Harry Massey.
So he says, yes, yeah. But I think we live in the Niagara region, so it's the hometown battle. I don't know if you can really attach yourself to them like you can sports teams, but that's got to be my answer. So thank you very much, Ewan, for joining us. This was absolutely incredible. I really, really enjoyed it. Maybe one day we can just do a whole episode just on musketry and really get down into the absolute nitty gritty. I think that'd be really, really great. But we really appreciate you coming on.
Well, just to offer to you both, Lee and Alex, if you're passing through London, don't do that without please giving me advance warning, because I can do some military history with you in a good way.
Awesome, that'd be great. We'll add that to the Prime and Load road trip episodes.
Yes, indeed.
So.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with a link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date on the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly known as X. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Artie Sun, and Adrian Berenegger. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.